Thank you, and so nice to see so many people gathering here today, considering the circumstances. I was told once that if you're not nervous when you're going to present, you don't care. So you'll be happy to know that I care a lot. All right, so today I'm going to present my thesis, Making the Dead Alive, Dynamic Routines in Risk Management. So I've been looking at how and why adaptation occur in risk management. So when I say risk management, I mean risk management within information security. And I've been looking into the context of organizations. So I think before we go ahead and start, we're going to go through some of the key concepts that I will be talking about, some terminology. What is this information that we're trying to secure? What are the risks towards it? What is risk management? And then after that, we'll focus a little bit of what I've been looking at in this thesis and what I found. So let's start from the beginning then. What is this information that we are trying to secure? Well, information can be said to be a vital asset, a vital business asset for any organization. Everything we do involve using information in some way. It's used to support our effective decision-making and facilitate the ongoing operations. What I mean is that information is anything that we use in our organization. It can be the clever ideas that you have in your head that you don't want your competitors to know about. But it could also be physical information or digital, which will be the focus hereafter, such as blueprints, customer details, anything of value that supports our ongoing operations, business that we have. So when I say assets hereafter, I'm referring to these types of information, that which is important to our organization, that which we need to make sure that we can protect, as with any other resource in an organization of value. Within information security, when we say protecting information, we specifically mean three things. First and foremost, that the assets that we value, that we need in our business, is available when we need them, that we can retrieve them, and that they are accurate, so they don't change over time, become wrongfully manipulated or deleted. And we need to make sure that if they are secret, they're confidential, that only the right people who should have access to them have access to them. Because if we can't live up to these three principles, then we're posing a risk to the organization. So what is risk then? Well, risk can be said to consist of three principles, parameters: asset, threats, and vulnerabilities. The assets, that's what we just talked about, the information that we need to protect in our organization, that which support our operation, what we value. So here is an example list of assets that could be in an organization that is worth protecting and that helps our operations. Threats, on the other hand, is any event or circumstance that could harm or pose damage to any of these assets. But threats are only dangerous towards us if we are vulnerable to them, if we are susceptible to these threats. So take payment details, for example, the first example asset here. That could be one type of asset that is worth protecting and something that we need to support our day-to-day operation in an organization. But nobody except the ones who should be able to view it should have access to it. So how do we know that? Who has access to it? Can any curious employee just have a look at all the payment details? Well, if we have no access control, no passwords, for example, or no policies that forbid them from snooping around in this information, then yeah, we are vulnerable to that type of threat, and that would pose a risk. So in this particular case, the threat would be the curious employee, and the vulnerability would not have a password or policy. Similarly, payment details, we need them to be accurate so that nobody wrongfully or rightfully, or just because they feel like it could go in afterwards and manipulate it, or it becomes corrupted over time. So how can we make sure that it remains accurate? Well, if we don't have any write access or no version control, so we can see how it has changed over time, or no validation to make sure that, yeah, it remains the same as we intended using bank ID or something like that, then yes, again, we would be vulnerable and that would pose a risk. But threat could be something entirely different too. If there is, when you finally do need these payment details in your operation, what if there is a thunderstorm going on, there is lightning coming and the power goes? Well, maybe then we can't retrieve this information if you don't have redundancy, if you don't have a cloud backup solution, for example. Then again, that will pose a risk. The threats can be and take many different forms and shapes. It could be humans, like a curious employee, or hackers for that matter. It can be technical, like failing hardware or viruses that spreads. But also natural events like flooding, earthquakes, fire, anything that could pose harm to our assets. If you're vulnerable to them, that would make a risk. So information security is the protection of information and information systems from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, even destruction, so that we can be certain and ensure that it is confidential if it is secret, that it has integrity and remains accurate over time, and that it is available when we need it. So information security is about managing risk. Managing risk, on the other hand, is a little bit what we talked about. It is to identify the threats towards this asset then and see if we are vulnerable. We'll also figure out if we can do something about it. Can we counteract it somehow? Could we implement some form of what I will call security control, measures that we can take in order to remove the vulnerability or lower the probability of a threat happening by adding passwords, for example, or cloud backup solutions. And this line of reasoning, this line of thinking is what we call risk management. And risk management is a continuous process. It's not just something that we do once, but we do it over and over again to try to identify the assets that we have, threats and vulnerabilities. So in its simplest form, risk management consists of at least these three main activities. You have the asset identification, a little bit what we talked about. Try to identify the assets that we have in our organization. What is important to us? We need to classify them. Is it the secret or is it public information? And evaluate it. How important is it to us? If something would happen to these assets, what would be the impact? Because when we know this, we can start to figure out how much it's worth to actually protect them. So we take this information and go into the next activity, the risk analysis. And here we try to, also a little bit what we talked about, try to identify the threats towards these assets. Are we vulnerable towards them? But more importantly, what could we do to counteract them? Could we implement some form of security control that could remove the vulnerability or lower the probability of a threat happening? So these motivated security controls, or the proposed security controls, is what we bring into the last activity, the risk treatment phase. Here we try to select which one of these security controls are relevant for us. We prioritize what order to start implementing them in, and we go ahead and implementing them to try to secure our assets. So by this logic, it follows kind of a sequential process in that respect. And we do this over and over again, not because we think that we can achieve perfect security, but in order to identify new coming assets that we have in our organization, assets that leave, or new threats that come along, or vulnerabilities, so that at least we know about as many risks as possible and can lower these risks down to an acceptable level where we as an organization think that, yeah, now we're comfortable. We know there are some risks, but we're comfortable living with those that we have. So there exist many different forms of processes for conducting risk management. But these three activities that we just covered are included in most of them. Here are three other examples of formalized risk management processes. They serve as instructions for what activities to carry out in order to systematically perform and implement risk management in our organizations. They serve sort of as a generic template for establishing a risk management work routine in that respect. But life is not always systematic, and these are generic after all, so we need to adapt them. We need to change them so they fit our organization, our context. So in this thesis, what I have been focusing on is the work routines for performing these formalized risk management processes and looking at how and why adaptations occur to them. So I've chosen to do this by looking at routines from this explanation model here, which I will go through a little bit, which is separated into something I call dead and alive routines. Dead routines are the formalized processes. They serve to control what to do with instructions. This is how you do it, but also inspire how we can implement it. Alive routines, on the other hand, is situated in practice. This refers to us as humans, how we interpret these instructions and how we translate that into actions, actually performing them. So in this respect then, let's see if I can get this annotations work. The formalized processes, instructions, serve as inspiration for us to figure out a strategy for how to go about starting to implement the different activities that are in the risk management processes. What should we do? But it also serves to instruct how to do it. What are the requirements? What are the steps, for example? How are we supposed to perform this risk management process? Alive routines, on the other hand, emphasize this relationship here between, on the one hand, strategy that we formulate, and on one hand, performance. As you may know from performing any other activity, when we do this over and over again, we tend to learn from them. We tend to gain experiences from doing this over and over. So these experiences that we gain from performing these activities can serve to reshape the strategy that we have, how we think about what we should do when we perform these activities. So it can help us establish a new understanding then for how we are supposed to carry out these management activities. So what this means then is that the strategy that we end up with, how we think about the risk management process and the activities we should produce, doesn't necessarily have to be an exact copy of the instructions that we had, but can be a something that we gained through experience that helped us shape and reformulate an idea of what to do. So this relationship here, then from strategy to formalized process, illustrate our interpretations of these instructions, or if we use them as a fact check, for example. Similarly, how we actually implement these instructions doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect match from the instructions. That could also be something that we gain from receiving a new strategy, a new understanding for how to go about doing this. Can therefore shape and change. This final implementation of these instructions can be seen in this relation. So this means that a live routine in this respect is something that is continuously shaping based on our understanding and based on our experience, and something that can take different shapes over time. But this give and take relationship here between, on the one side, dead routines, and on the other side, alive routines, when we know the instruction, but we adapt to them, we change and we learn, is what I have come to call dynamic routine. So I set out to study how and why dynamic routines occur in risk management. So why is this important then? Why would I study this? Well, two reasons. First reason is that there are relatively few studies conducted in how information security is practiced. It's a very sensitive nature. Not a lot of organizations are willing to discuss just how they are performing these activities, how to go about protecting themselves. There are a lot of studies that has been focusing on the formalized process of things and the strategy, what we want to do, the intention of implementing these. But this also means that we know relatively little about how organizations actually go about protecting themselves. So what I set out to do was to conduct empirical studies within information security risk management. I did this with interviews and observations. So I carried out these empirical studies in public sector organizations and government agencies. One reason for this was that, at least in Sweden, thanks to the principle of public access to information, it became generally easier to get hold of these types of organizations' formalized processes, their internal documents, their instructions, and so forth. But I was also allowed to study and ask them about how they perform these activities, how their work routines look like, as long as they didn't reveal any sensitive content or details about specific security measures. The other reason is that there are studies indicating that risk management is a complicated and complex process to implement, and something that we need to keep alive over time, change and adjust, because things vary and new perspective comes. So we need to formulate new strategies for what we should do. But it remains unclear, though, how similar adaptations and how and why similar adaptations occur from performing these in practice. So because of this reason, then, I have chosen in this thesis to focus on this performance aspect of performing risk management routines. So what did I see then when I studied risk management activities from this performance perspective? But if we start with the first risk management activity, asset identification. One respondent said that it's difficult to admit that maybe we don't follow the routines, especially if the boss is present in the meeting, and that maybe we're a little bit uncertain about the risk management process. So what is this quote about then? Well, when I was looking at asset identification, I saw two different cases, two different organizations that seem to have difficulties separating the activity of asset identification with aspects of risk that usually comes in risk analysis. Instead, as one of the respondents said, well, it helps to bring in different perspective when we try to figure out the value of information, such as what could, for example, harm the impact of an asset. So they started to talk about the different probabilities of risk or threats. But the same respondent also added that, sort of a little bit with a tone as if there was something wrong with doing that, that when these types of discussion come and go, I mean, we have to intervene and say that these are different things. We're supposed to focus now on asset valuation and not probabilities of different threats. These are different activities. So this is an example where we see how the formalized processes strongly influence how they are performing the activity, even though they saw it as meaningful to keep these discussions. So looking around to see if there were other organizations that have similar ideas about this, about strongly separating activities, I came across this one organization that was in their early phase of implementing the risk management process. And in this workshop where they were about to identify their assets and put a value on them, they soon kind of drifted into these discussions of different probabilities of threats. Yeah, well, we have this super sensitive information here, but under that circumstance, if that happens, then we would actually disclose this information, and that would not be very good. Well, yeah, it's not very probable, but these were the types of discussion that were going on until one of the workshop participants intervened and said that, yeah, well, I'm pretty sure that most of these risks will come up later when we do the risk analysis, more or less aborting the entire discussion, and many of these threats became undocumented. When we asked about this later, respondents said that, well, it kind of comes natural to us to discuss threats when we're talking about different assets and their values. So how come they didn't allow then these discussions to continue? Because they too seem to find it meaningful. Well, one possible reason came later from one of the respondents saying that, well, it's difficult to admit that maybe we don't follow the routines, especially if the boss is around, and that may indeed show that they're feeling a little bit uncertain about the risk management process. So in these two examples, did any of these give rise to a dynamic routine in that respect? No, they did not. So if we go back to the explanation model and see a little bit what happened if we look from this performance aspect. Well, we can see here, for first and foremost, there was this mismatch then between the instructions and what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to implement them. In fact, they were discussing different aspects of threats, when they were supposed to only then discuss asset values, because they saw it as meaningful and helped them with different perspectives. However, these insights that they gained from this experience that it might actually help us, did on the other hand not change the strategy for how in the future go about doing this activity, possibly because it made them seem uncertain about the risk management process. And in that respect, it didn't give rise to any dynamic routines. So even though it was perceived as meaningful to have this type of discussion, they came to conform again with these instructions to follow the intended process. So this is one example of dynamic routines did not occur. What about the next risk management activity? The risk analysis. I read another quote from one participant saying that, well, we miss maybe 5% of risks that are never found, and the only way to find them is to make a unique risk analysis. But our way of doing it still covers most of the risks, and it provides a much better use of resources. So where did this quote come from then? Well, to understand it, we need to back a little bit and see two different cases here when I looked at the risk analysis. Because here is an example of, contrary to asset identification, where experiences gained from doing this over and over again actually came to shape the strategy for how to go about doing this activity in the future. So looking into risk analysis, there were these two organizations that described risk analysis as one of those activities that take a lot of time to do. It was very resource draining. And to top it off, they also started to notice that for particular types of assets, the same type of threats kept on occurring. It was almost the same vulnerabilities every time. So they felt like we're doing this over and over again, but we more or less already know the outcome of it. Is there any other way we can do this that would be more efficient? Well, one of the organizations, they started using something that they call security profiles, basically predefined batteries of security controls. So when you had a specific type of asset, say personal details, you already knew sort of what security controls to start to implement. And only if there were some risks that was seen as out of the ordinary, or you were implementing these assets in a system that might have different threats that are out of the ordinary, did they conduct a risk analysis. They said also that, well, this puts a lot of pressure on our people and knowing what it means with normal operations and threats like this, but it becomes sort of like a trimmed down version of the risk analysis activity. The other organization had a very similar approach. Here they had instead a list of predefined security controls, and for each asset that they were gonna protect, they looked into this list and they said, okay, which of these security controls are relevant for this particular type of asset? So they used that as a filter to filter out the relevant controls. And after that, they saw, okay, which of these security controls haven't we implemented already? And only for those did they conduct a risk analysis. So here they also kind of turned the process around a little bit. Instead of looking at the asset, threats, and vulnerabilities to figure out security controls, the security controls were already figured out. And they only did a risk analysis to see what are the risks with not implementing the ones that we don't have. They also admitted as much that by doing this, it might actually result in slightly less secure operations, like we see here in the quote, that miss maybe 5% of the risk that we haven't thought of already. The risk that we don't have come up with security controls for, at least. But by doing this way instead, it made so much more sense to them because it provided a better use of resources. So that's how they did it. So in these two cases, did they give rise then to a dynamic routine? Yes, they did. So let's go back to the model here and see what we saw. So the first thing we saw here is a mismatch then from the instructions and how they were implementing them. In fact, they came to even change these. So instead of implementing the, instead of basing the implementation on the existing process, since they came to see that there are similar threats that keep on occurring. This inspired them instead to formulate another idea for how they could go about doing this, another strategy for how to go about doing this. So it came to change. So that means that these experienced shortcomings then of performing a unique risk analysis over and over again led them not to follow the instructions, but instead inspired them to come up with this new way of doing it, this new approach. So figuring out a new strategy for how they could do this activity. And in that sense, gave rise to a dynamic routine. And this new understanding for how they went about performing this activity was even introduced then into the formalized processes, and the instructions were adapted accordingly. They actually came to change their formal process. This is how we do it now. So they changed the entire process based on these insights that they got from carrying out the activity over and over again. The last risk management activity that I looked at, risk treatment here, we have one quote from one of the respondents or practitioners. But then we found that we don't really have the technology to live up to these security controls that we actually wanted to implement, and that costs of implementing it would be too high. So we had to settle for something cheaper. But again, two of the organizations that I studied here, they described a scenario where they had gone through all the activities. They had identified the assets that they had. They had conducted the risk analysis. And based on the risk analysis, they had come up with a set of security controls that they wanted to implement. But first, when they were in the risk treatment activity, did they realize that, hold on, this doesn't hold up. These are way too costly, for example. Or there's no chance we can live up to this technical complexity. We can't implement these security controls. They're simply too complicated for us. We have to do something about it. So what did they do? Well, in these two cases, they described that when this happens, well, we have to go back to the risk analysis. We have to change them. We can't live up to these expectations. So we need to lower them to something that we can actually live up to. And looking into the instructions of these companies, one of the organization's instructions actually told them that during the risk analysis, it's good if you include other different types of aspects, such as cost, for example, when you derive at different types of security controls. But when we asked about it, the respondents said that, well, yeah, the instructions are clear and everything, but there's something missing here in terms of just how much time or money we can spend on it. So even though they had instructions for it, it was not clear how to make this into an actual action and practice. So these two examples, did they give rise to a dynamic routine then? Yes, they did. So let's go back to this explanation model and see what happens from this performance aspect. Well, here again, we can see this mismatch between, on the one hand, formalized processes, the instructions that they were supposed to implement, and how they actually went about implementing them. In fact, it wasn't covered in their instructions that if you're uncertain if it doesn't hold up with the security controls, you can go back and change it. So instead of this proposed security controls from the risk analysis was not implemented because they were seen as either complex or too costly. Instead, they went back to the risk analysis and they changed this output to meet the expectations of the insights that they gained first from doing the risk treatment activity. So here we have a good example of where insights from practice changed the expectations for previous activities. And in this sense, also gave rise to a dynamic routine. So, but this also points a little bit about the mismatch here between the formalized processes and the strategy, in the sense that they had instructions for this, but it wasn't really clear how they could translate this and then to a strategy for what to do. All right. So by studying routines from this performance perspective, it was clear that dynamic routines do occur in response to new circumstances. But how do dynamic routines occur then? Well, from this explanation model that we just went through, it was clear that dynamic routines can occur in response to complexity. Is there any way that we could make this simpler, speed the process up a little bit? Like we saw with the risk analysis case. Here we have an example of where doing this over and over again helped them shape a new understanding for how they could do this activity in the future that would save them time and resources. But dynamic routines could also occur as an adaptation of expectations, sort of as an interplay between activities. Like the proposed security controls from the risk analysis, they weren't acted upon because they were seen as either too costly or too complex from the insights that they gained first after they were about to implement them. So based on this experience, they can go back and they could adjust these expectations to fit their reality. So why is this important then? Well, by studying activities then from this performance aspect, we can get an understanding for how practitioners reason and what they perceive to be meaningful, and why a risk management process is shaped in a particular fashion. So what are the implications of this then? Well, we can take this concept then of dead and live routines and the concept of dynamic routines, and we can use that to break down activities to see our strengths and weaknesses. Take a generic process for risk management. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will fit in every organization under every circumstance. But breaking it down into this explanation model here, we can start to see where it differs. Is it perhaps a mismatch between the formalized process and how it is performed? Maybe we understand the instructions perfectly, but maybe we don't have the right equipment to perform it, so we can't, so the implementation varies. Or maybe just by mere experience, we figured out a better way of doing this that would change the implementation slightly. Well, these are insights that we could capitalize on. We have some experience here that we can probably draw some use on. Or is it perhaps that there is a mismatch between the formalized processes and the strategy that we develop? Maybe we have all the equipment we need in order to implement this process, but we don't really agree with the instructions, or we don't understand them. So they become a mismatch here in between the instructions and the strategy that we formulate. So this too can also give some insights then into where we need extra training, for example, or more clarity. So by taking this concept then of dynamic routines, one proposal then for future studies is to actually use this to help break down activities to see how we can use this to reach a better organizational fit. And we can study this then in different types of organizations, different types of companies, different sizes, countries and cultures, to see what are the results we get from this, and could it perhaps lead to understanding how we can secure organization better by reaching a better organizational fit. And since there exists relatively little empirical research within how security is practiced, but there are suggestions that adaptations do occur. We need to shape the process so that it fits us. This could be one way of looking into it, dynamic routines, to see how and where it starts to differ, and how and why it differs. And that, in a nutshell, has been the aim and the study of my thesis. So I want to thank you all for having paid attention and listened to my presentation of making the dead alive, dynamic routines in risk management. Thank you.